This video has been brought to you in part by Worldbuilding. Light up the forge! Welcome everyone to the first episode of our new show, Tale Tips, where I use my vast robot intellect to answer the questions you have about writing, storytelling, and fiction, provided I can come up with anything useful. It's still Tale Foundry, just a slightly different Foundry from the one you're used to seeing. That's because, with the help of our new little friend, we were able to get the Foundry's old indexing system thing back up and running. Honestly, I can't make head or tail of any of the ancient files stored in there, but it does make for a nice slideshow projector, doesn't it? So, while our humans are hard at work writing original short stories and creating big, overproduced videos about our favorite fiction, let's do a little something on the side, shall we? The first question we're going to answer on this show is one almost every writer asks at some point in their career, but especially those who are figuring out how to share their made-up worlds. Our lovely patron, Samantha Ray Lynn, asks, "What tips do you have for world building to prevent it from turning into exposition?" On the surface, it sounds like a simple question, doesn't it? After thinking about it for a few days, I can assure you that it is anything but. Samantha, this is positively brimming over with secondary questions, considerations, and complex nuances. It reaches far beyond the limits of world building and touches almost every part of storytelling, which makes it a joy for me to try my hand at. Thanks for asking. I have two suggestions for you before I get to the real advice. The first is a simple shift in perspective. There's world building which occurs outside the storytelling process, and then there's narrative world building. The world building you do outside the story, map making, place naming, history writing, all that, doesn't necessarily bear too much on whether you end up stacking dry leaves of information upon your audience. So long as you aren't caught up in the gyre of world builder syndrome, unable to begin writing your story because you haven't painted the spots on every beetle, I wouldn't worry too much about what you build outside the story. What really matters are the pieces of world building which make it into the narrative. How much are you telling your audience about the world over the course of the story? How are you telling it? This is where you run the risk of cutting and drying your world out, where we begin to battle the scourge that is exposition. Except, it isn't. Not really. The second suggestion I have for you is also a shift in perspective. It may seem a little contrary to the common wisdom show don't tell, but exposition isn't a bad thing. Far from it. The problem is that exposition unto itself is not an experience. Description, action, argument, these forms of communication all offer some kind of sensory stimulus or motion, experience, to the audience. Exposition is just the sharing of information outside of the experience. And that certainly has its uses where the more experiential methods of communication fail, but for that reason, it does tend to be less engaging. This becomes a problem when your audience is forced to slog through long swaths of expository text which offer troves of valuable information and context, but nothing to experience. Info dumps. If the story is meant to be immersive and engaging, these parts of it are likely where that effect will end. In fewer words, exposition in the right context? Good. Info dumps in most stories? Bad. And this is true of pretty much all information in your story, not just for the world building. With this understanding, the question becomes something more along the lines of, what tips do you have for narrative to prevent info dumps? Which, not being a geographer or scientist of any kind, I find leagues easier to answer than almost anything about world building at all. So, Samantha, having duly usurped your question, sorry, I've got 3 approaches for you that, with some luck, should work out nicely. So, the first method, scatter your exposition. When you understand so much about your story and you're so painfully aware that your audience doesn't know any of it, it can be really tempting to close that gap as quickly as possible. But the truth is that, in most info dumps, even if all of the information is necessary for the audience to understand the context and motions of the story, not all of it is usually necessary right this very moment. And when all of that tangential stuff piles up in one place, it halts the story and turns the experience into an explanation. So the trick here is to identify which pieces of information are necessary to the story and to share them in appropriate contexts. Sometimes that comes long before the necessity of the information becomes apparent, sometimes it isn't until right before. But you can tell the context is right because the exposition won't interrupt or distract from the telling of the story. The result is that you end up gathering all your piles of pertinent info and scattering them to the winds. And when these little bits and pieces are seeded appropriately into the rich soil of relevant context, they actually have the opposite effect of info dumps on the audience. They take root, help the experience to blossom more fully in the audience's mind. Author Kelly Wallace does this beautifully in her short story, No Portraits on the Sky, which you can read or listen to for free in issue 79 of Clarkesworld Digital Magazine. The story has a very healthy blend of showing and telling, but reserves much of the exposition for the right moments. For instance, the opening paragraphs mention sky wardens. The only thing appropriate to share about them now is that the stranger falling from the sky in the first paragraph isn't one of them. He's not wearing their tools, ropes, soft, sticky gloves the color of spider silk. It's not until later on in the story, when we discover that the protagonist's daughter was a sky warden who disappeared, that we learn what a sky warden is. Someone who climbs up the branches of the tallest trees and into the damaged sky, trying to fix it. It would have been easy for the author to try and front-load all of that information so that we don't have to wonder what a sky warden is, but ultimately the difference between learning it sooner and learning it later is simply that, this way, we didn't have to put the experience on hold in order to answer the question. She found the right context for both pieces of exposition, scattered them out, and over the course of the story, they bloomed into something vivid. But there may not always be a later. What if your story doesn't give you any other opportunity to share those fragments of information? If you're clever, maybe you can find a way to create a context for it, although that can come off a little contrived, writing your story to deliver information rather than sharing information to help tell your story. How do you avoid an info dump when there's just no other good place to put all of it? This is probably the method most of you were waiting for, and definitely the most rewarding of the three. You hide it. Make your information implicit rather than explicit. It's also the most complex of the three approaches. There are so many ways to do this. Of course there are. This is, after all, the beloved show don't tell. There are literally endless techniques for showing effectively. We could probably make a video on that alone. Maybe we should. But however you go about it, the gist of it is that instead of telling your audience things outright, you help them to make inferences. So, in the middle of description, action, argument, or any other kind of experiential text, they're also learning things about the story without ever being told. They come to conclusions on their own, based on what they've been through so far. For instance, in the original short story we wrote for our world-building series, The Wilting Sound, we had a lot to share with the audience about the setting. The world it takes place in was created for us by Adrian Volbrecht, and it is very, very different from the one we live in. One key feature is that all the denizens are born with twins. They're told that without their twin to keep their souls split in half, they turn into terrible, cannibalistic monsters. Thus, to keep the population safe, single-born children are put to death, and everyone carries a poisonous flower bud in a bracelet on their wrist, like a cyanide capsule, in case something should ever happen to their other half. It's a lot to set up, and we didn't want to ruin the experience with an info dump. Instead, we both scattered that information throughout the story and implied it through other types of writing. You learn that it's a world of twins in the first several paragraphs by experiencing the prospective character's grief at her twin's absence. You hear characters voice their concern about whether a single-born child will become a monster. You watch one character swallow the bud and see what happens. Hopefully it turned out well in that story, but this should give you some inkling of how it works. Experiences are a great place to hide information. Another good place to hide information is in small clues. You can suggest a whole lot to the audience simply by selecting the right words or including the right details. Author Joe Walton calls this technique incluing because, through your decisions in the text, you're cluing the audience into things about your story. The example she uses is the phrase, "the door dilated open," which was used in multiple places by Robert Heinlein. This one word, dilated, tells us something about the setting. It's so futuristic that even mundane pieces of technology like doors work differently. Except, it also doesn't tell us anything at all. It's one singular word, and we as an audience do the work of extrapolating its meaning. So, if you find yourself explaining a lot about your world, think about what the audience might be able to pick up in just a few very suggestive bits of language and see if that can do the job all on its own. 2 quick words of caution about this whole hiding information, show don't tell thing though. It's very hard to fake. If what you're doing is telling or delivering information explicitly but trying to disguise it, it can actually be worse for immersion. The key culprit here is a phenomenon known as you know, Bob, or maid-and-butler dialogue, wherein 2 characters who have no reason to need or want an explanation take the time to exposit information to each other for the audience's sake. It damages the integrity of the characters and the fiction and makes the audience aware of themselves, which can be really hard to recover from. Check out the podcast Writing Excuses, Season 15, Episode 9 for some great commentary on this. You may also want to be careful with how liberally you use this whole method. Unsurprisingly, hidden information can, at times, be difficult to see. So, if it's really important and it's hidden a bit too well, you do run the risk that the audience doesn't notice and ends up confused later. Incluing can be particularly tricky here. My advice would be, if you've got to be implicit with a very important piece of information, maybe try the show and tell method, where you turn it into an experience, let the audience take it in, then confirm it later on with some small piece of direct exposition. It can be a bit redundant, but it's better than an info dump, and it mitigates some of that risk. Okay. Scattering information is a good way to break up info dumps, making the information implicit is a good way to hide them. What are you supposed to do when neither of those methods work? When there are no good places to scatter the bits and pieces to, no good ways to turn them into an experience? Well, I'm sure there are other ways I haven't thought of, but the last thing I want to suggest to you is to get rid of it. Kill your darlings, as they say. If a piece of information is really, truly important, but you find there's no way to convey it without harming the story, take some time to consider whether that information will matter to the audience, or whether it just matters to you and your desires for the story. If it's just something fun on the side you want to include to add some additional richness to the world or the characters or something, by all means, tuck it in there somewhere. Use the methods we've described to weave it into your story. But if you can't do that, if this thing is such a bad fit for the story you're writing that you'd have to damage the experience in order to include it, maybe don't. It's painful, believe me. We had to do this for the original novella we wrote for our Terry Pratchett series, Automata on Cue. One of the characters is a very strange AI, and in the first draft, we felt it was really important to explain who made her and why, what that process had looked like. But in revision, it became clear that the only detail which mattered was the fact that she was, in fact, an AI. Everything else was extraneous material, stuff we wanted to include because we'd already made it. There was no good way to squeeze it into the story. To this very day, not one soul outside the Foundry knows the name of the character who invented the AI in that story, or what their original motives were. You can guess, there are some trace hints, but the rest, a creative ghost. Maybe they'll even surface in another story, one which has a little more room for them. So, Samantha, I hope that answers your question, and I hope it helps your writing to be a little less, dumpy. Of course, it could be hard to put any of this to use at all if you don't know how to organize your world or connect it to your story to begin with. Luckily, our sponsor for this video makes that incredibly easy. World Anvil is a browser-based world-building platform designed for writers, novelists, tabletop game masters, game developers, anyone who has a world in their head that needs building. With tools for linking together your content like a wiki, creating interactive maps, timelines, and family trees, and options for choosing who to share all of it with, World Anvil will keep your creation safe, well-organized, and easy to consume. And that's just the world-building side of it. Now you can even use the platform's new novel writing software to write, plan, plot, and, shockingly, even publish your stories. As in, publish for money. The real deal. go to worldanvil.com/talefoundry to sign up for free. And if you want to join the guild there, which will unlock a veritable arsenal of amazing features like comprehensive privacy settings, presentation options, and so much more, you can use the code TaleFoundry to save up to 20% on your membership. Again, that's worldanvil.com/talefoundry, and the code, of course, is TaleFoundry. Go light up the forge. And finally, before we wrap up, I'd like to give a quick thanks to all the helpful humans who support the show on Patreon. All those words you see scrolling in the background of these videos, those are actually the names of our Patreon maintenance crew, without whom this show would not be possible. And a special word to all of our top patrons, Excelsius, Lord Gate, Puzzling Shutterbug, and the Autumn Rider. Thank you so much. We'll be deciding on our next Tale Tips question soon, so follow us on social media to ask a question of your own, or join us on Patreon if you want to choose which question we attempt to answer. Until then, thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next time. Bye!